Sometimes the most powerful people in the world look completely ordinary until someone mistakes their dignity for weakness. The first thing anyone noticed that humid Georgia afternoon was not the flashing patrol lights. It was a young black woman kneeling quietly on the shoulder of Interstate 75 while traffic crawled past at barely 20 miles per hour. Drivers slowed their vehicles, passengers lifted their phones, and conversations stopped the moment they realized something unusual was unfolding beneath the bright southern sun. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply remained still, her hands resting calmly in front of her, her eyes fixed on the pavement as if she refused to let the humiliation define who she was. A few feet away stood Officer Ethan Walker, 26 years old, barely 8 months into his career with the county police department. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his badge reflected the afternoon light, and his posture carried the confidence of someone determined to prove he belonged behind the badge. Every decision he made that day felt, in his mind, like another step toward becoming the kind of officer he had always imagined. The growing crowd only reinforced his determination. He believed every pair of watching eyes expected certainty, not hesitation. The woman before him was Maya Brooks, 28 years old, an accomplished attorney who preferred quiet mornings, long drives, and a life that rarely attracted attention. She had left Atlanta after attending a legal conference and was driving toward a neighboring county to spend the weekend with family. Nothing about her appearance suggested wealth or influence. She wore simple business attire beneath a light jacket, comfortable shoes for the drive, and carried herself with effortless composure. Her luxury sedan was clean but understated, blending into the steady flow of interstate traffic. Even now, surrounded by flashing lights and curious strangers, her breathing remained steady. She understood that fear often spread faster than facts, and she refused to add more emotion to an already tense moment. Around them, the highway seemed to hold its breath. Tractor-trailers rolled slowly past. Families returning from weekend trips stared through their windows. A delivery driver quietly shook his head before reaching for his phone. 2 college students standing near a nearby gas station whispered to each other while recording from a respectful distance. Nobody knew how the encounter had begun. Nobody knew what had been said only minutes earlier. All they could see was a uniformed officer standing over a calm woman who appeared to present no immediate threat. Ethan noticed the growing number of cameras but interpreted them differently. Instead of questioning whether the situation might look troubling, he convinced himself that transparency would validate every choice he made. Training echoed inside his mind, reminding him to stay in control, project authority, and never appear uncertain. Experience, however, had never taught him that authority without judgment could become something entirely different. Maya slowly lifted her eyes toward the endless line of passing vehicles. She recognized the expressions on unfamiliar faces. Some reflected sympathy. Others reflected confusion. A few simply watched because extraordinary moments have a strange way of capturing ordinary people. She could have spoken. She could have reached for a name that carried enormous influence throughout the state. She could have ended everything with a single sentence. Instead, she remained silent, believing that truth carried far greater weight when it arrived on its own. In the distance, almost hidden beyond the shimmering summer heat rising from the asphalt, several dark sport utility vehicles quietly exited the interstate. Their movement was calm, deliberate, and impossible to notice unless someone happened to be looking in exactly the right direction. None of the bystanders paid attention. Ethan certainly did not. But within the next few minutes, every assumption made on that quiet stretch of Georgia highway would begin to collapse under the weight of a truth that no badge, no uniform, and no first impression could ever outrun. The line of dark sport utility vehicles continued moving with quiet precision, still far enough away that they blended into the afternoon traffic. Their presence went unnoticed by nearly everyone gathered along the shoulder, where attention remained fixed on the silent encounter between Officer Ethan Walker and Maya Brooks. A warm breeze carried the sound of passing engines across the highway, yet the atmosphere somehow felt unnaturally still. Ethan glanced toward the growing crowd and noticed more phones pointed in his direction than before. He reminded himself that public attention did not change procedure. At least that was what he believed. He took a slow breath and spoke in a measured voice, asking Maya once again whether there was anything she wished to add before he completed his report. She calmly looked up at him, her expression steady, almost compassionate, and quietly answered, "I have nothing to add right now, officer." Her composure unsettled him more than anger ever could have. Most people argued. Some demanded supervisors. Others protested loudly or tried to explain every detail. Maya did none of those things. She simply accepted the uncomfortable moment without surrendering her dignity. That silence created questions Ethan did not know how to answer. He briefly reviewed the information displayed on the computer inside his patrol vehicle. Her driver's license was valid. The registration matched the vehicle. There were no warrants, no alerts, no indication that she posed any threat. Yet something inside him insisted he had to follow the path he had already chosen. Admitting uncertainty in front of dozens of witnesses felt, to him, like admitting failure. Nearby, an elderly couple watched from inside their parked sedan. The husband quietly lowered his window and whispered that the young woman appeared remarkably calm. His wife nodded but said nothing, continuing to watch with concern. A delivery driver standing beside his van stopped recording for a moment and simply observed, as though waiting for someone to restore a sense of normalcy. Even the afternoon traffic seemed slower now, with curious drivers glancing toward the shoulder before continuing down Interstate 75. Maya closed her eyes for only a second, remembering advice her father had given her years earlier. He had often said that character was revealed most clearly when nobody expected kindness or patience. Those words echoed softly in her mind. She knew exactly how easily this moment could change if she reached for her phone or mentioned a single name recognized throughout Georgia. She chose not to. Respect for the law meant allowing truth to emerge through the proper process rather than through personal influence. Ethan radioed dispatch again, requesting another verification of her identity. The dispatcher responded politely that additional confirmation was still being processed. There was nothing unusual in the tone of the reply, yet the slight delay left Ethan feeling increasingly uncomfortable. Experience might have told an older officer that unusual delays sometimes meant unusual circumstances. Ethan had not served long enough to recognize that pattern. Then, almost at the same moment, several people in the crowd slowly turned their heads toward the interstate exit. The black sport utility vehicles had left the highway and were now approaching with calm purpose instead of urgency. There were no blaring sirens, no dramatic gestures, only disciplined movement that seemed strangely deliberate. Maya noticed them immediately but revealed nothing on her face. Ethan followed the direction of the crowd's attention, narrowing his eyes as the vehicles drew closer. For the first time since the traffic stop had begun, certainty quietly slipped away, replaced by a question he could not yet explain. The vehicles rolled closer until they formed an orderly line several yards behind the patrol cars. Their dark paint reflected the afternoon sunlight, and every movement seemed carefully coordinated rather than hurried. People standing near the shoulder instinctively stepped back, lowering their voices without knowing exactly why. Ethan watched the convoy through narrowed eyes, trying to identify the agency. There were no dramatic gestures, no confusion, only disciplined professionalism. The sight unsettled him because it did not match anything he had expected from an ordinary traffic stop. One by one, well-dressed security personnel exited the vehicles and quietly surveyed the area. They did not rush toward anyone. They simply observed, communicating through discreet earpieces while maintaining calm expressions. Their confidence came from preparation rather than intimidation. Ethan instinctively adjusted his posture and rested one hand near his duty belt, reminding himself to remain composed. He had no reason to believe he had done anything improper, yet a quiet feeling of uncertainty continued growing inside him. Maya remained exactly where she was, showing neither relief nor anxiety. She looked toward the approaching vehicles for only a brief moment before lowering her eyes again. To the people watching, she appeared remarkably peaceful, almost as though she had expected this moment to arrive without needing to summon it herself. A young woman standing among the bystanders whispered that whoever was arriving must be important. Another replied that important people usually arrived with noise, not silence. That simple observation proved surprisingly accurate. One of the security agents approached Ethan with respectful professionalism and introduced himself without raising his voice. He politely requested confirmation of the situation and asked whether everyone was safe. Ethan answered that the scene was under control and briefly summarized the traffic stop. The agent listened carefully without interrupting, occasionally glancing toward Maya before thanking Ethan for the information. His calm demeanor revealed nothing, making it impossible to determine what he was thinking. Moments later, another black sedan entered the scene at a measured pace. It was neither flashy nor heavily marked, yet the subtle reaction among the security personnel immediately changed the atmosphere. Several agents straightened slightly, opening a clear path toward the shoulder of the highway. The surrounding crowd became almost completely silent. Even passing drivers seemed to slow as curiosity spread across the interstate. Ethan noticed the change and felt his heartbeat quicken. He could not explain why, but every instinct told him that the person inside the arriving vehicle carried extraordinary responsibility. The rear passenger door opened. A distinguished man in his early 60s stepped onto the pavement wearing a tailored navy suit with understated elegance. His expression was calm, thoughtful, and remarkably controlled. He did not scan the crowd searching for attention. Instead, his eyes immediately found Maya. For a brief second, the composure on his face softened into unmistakable concern before returning to quiet discipline. He walked forward with measured steps, acknowledging the security personnel with a slight nod but never taking his attention away from the young woman. Maya slowly lifted her eyes and offered him a gentle smile that carried reassurance rather than fear. The bystanders exchanged confused looks. Nobody spoke his name, yet many sensed they were witnessing something far larger than a routine roadside encounter. Ethan remained standing in respectful silence, unaware that the next few words spoken on that Georgia highway would permanently reshape both his career and his understanding of authority, responsibility, and the true meaning of justice. The distinguished man stopped a few feet from Maya and looked at her with the quiet concern of a father before turning his attention toward Officer Ethan Walker. His voice remained calm, measured, and almost gentle when he asked, "Are you all right?" Maya answered with the same composure she had shown from the beginning. "Yes, Dad. I am fine." Those three simple words seemed to remove every sound from the highway. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs as his eyes moved from Maya to the man standing beside her. He had seen that face before, not in person, but on televised press conferences, official state announcements, and newspaper headlines. Standing before him was David Brooks, the Attorney General of Georgia. The realization arrived without drama, yet its weight settled over everyone present. Several bystanders quietly lowered their phones, while others continued recording, realizing they had become witnesses to a moment that would soon reach far beyond the shoulder of Interstate 75. David Brooks did not raise his voice. He did not demand special treatment. Instead, he slowly looked toward his daughter, noticed that she was still kneeling, and calmly said, "You may stand now." Maya rose gracefully, brushing a small amount of dust from her clothing without displaying anger or satisfaction. She simply stood beside her father with quiet confidence. Ethan instinctively stepped back, his carefully rehearsed certainty replaced by genuine confusion. He opened his mouth to explain the situation but paused, searching for words that suddenly felt inadequate. David Brooks gave him the opportunity to speak. "Officer," he said respectfully, "please tell me exactly what happened from the beginning." The invitation surprised Ethan. There was no accusation in the Attorney General's tone, only a sincere request for facts. Ethan carefully described the traffic stop, his observations, and the decisions he had made. As he spoke, David Brooks listened without interruption, occasionally nodding but never revealing judgment. Maya also remained silent, allowing Ethan to finish every sentence before anyone else responded. The surrounding security personnel maintained a respectful distance, making no effort to influence the conversation. When Ethan completed his explanation, David Brooks thanked him for remaining professional throughout the discussion. Then he quietly asked a single question. "Before making each decision today, did you observe any specific action that suggested my daughter presented an immediate danger to you or to anyone else? Ethan hesitated. He replayed every moment in his mind. The valid driver's license, the clean registration, the cooperative attitude, the calm voice, the absence of threats. For the first time since the traffic stop began, he recognized the difference between uncertainty and evidence. He answered honestly, "No, sir." David Brooks nodded slowly, not with triumph but with sadness. "Honesty is always the first step toward accountability," he replied. "The law gives public servants tremendous responsibility. It also asks us to exercise sound judgment with every citizen, especially when no one knows who that citizen may be." His words carried no anger, only quiet conviction. Around them, the crowd remained completely silent. The afternoon sun continued shining across the highway as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet every person standing there understood they had witnessed something unforgettable. Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment, realizing that the greatest lesson of his young career had not arrived through punishment or public embarrassment. It had arrived through the calm dignity of a woman who never used her family's influence to escape the moment, and through a father whose first instinct had been to seek truth before demanding justice. Within minutes, senior supervisors from the county police department arrived at the scene after receiving urgent notifications from dispatch. Their vehicles parked quietly behind the existing patrol cars, and the mood along the highway shifted once again. The supervisors greeted the Attorney General with professional courtesy before asking everyone involved to remain exactly where they were until the initial review could begin. Nobody raised a voice. Nobody attempted to assign blame. The process itself became the center of attention. David Brooks thanked the supervisors for responding promptly and made one request that surprised nearly everyone listening. He said that his office would not seek special treatment and that every decision should be based entirely on documented facts, recorded evidence, and established policy. Maya looked at her father with quiet appreciation because she had heard those principles throughout her childhood. They were not words reserved for public speeches. They were values he practiced even when the situation became deeply personal. Ethan stood silently a short distance away, replaying every decision he had made since activating his emergency lights earlier that afternoon. He realized that confidence without experience could become dangerous when it replaced careful observation. His field training had emphasized officer safety and sound procedure, but another lesson now became painfully clear. Every citizen deserved the same careful judgment regardless of appearance, background, or assumption. One supervising lieutenant requested access to the patrol vehicle recordings, and Ethan immediately provided everything without hesitation. His body camera footage, dashboard camera recordings, and radio communications were preserved exactly as they had occurred. The lieutenant thanked him for his cooperation and explained that transparency protected both officers and the public. Maya quietly nodded in agreement. She knew that complete documentation often revealed the truth more effectively than emotional arguments ever could. Around them, many bystanders slowly returned to their vehicles, yet several remained long enough to watch the respectful conversation continue. Some exchanged thoughtful comments about how differently the situation had unfolded than they expected. There had been no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, and no public demands for revenge. Instead, everyone witnessed something far less common and perhaps far more powerful. They witnessed responsible people allowing truth to develop through patience rather than emotion. Before leaving, David Brooks turned toward Ethan one final time. His expression remained serious but not hostile. "Officer Walker," he said calmly, "every public servant will eventually face a day that tests judgment more than knowledge. What matters is what you choose to learn after that day ends." Ethan met his eyes and answered honestly, "Yes, sir. I understand." For the first time since the traffic stop began, he truly meant those words. Maya then stepped forward and spoke with quiet sincerity. "I do not want this to become a story about one person. I want it to become a lesson that helps prevent another family from experiencing the same moment." Her statement settled over the highway with remarkable simplicity. The supervising officers listened carefully, recognizing that accountability did not always begin with punishment. Sometimes it began with humility, honest reflection, and the willingness to improve. As the afternoon slowly gave way to early evening, the flashing emergency lights were switched off one by one. Traffic resumed its normal pace. The crowd dispersed. The shoulder of Interstate 75 gradually returned to ordinary silence. Yet everyone who had stood there understood that the events of that afternoon would not end beside the highway. The recordings, the investigation, and the conversations that followed would travel across the state, carrying with them a lesson that reached far beyond one traffic stop. It was a reminder that authority earned respect only when guided by fairness, and that true justice never depended upon knowing who someone was before deciding to treat them with dignity. The following weeks unfolded far differently than anyone standing on the shoulder of Interstate 75 could have imagined. The official review examined every recording, every radio transmission, every written report, and every decision made during the encounter. Investigators approached the case with patience rather than haste because everyone understood that public confidence depended upon facts instead of assumptions. Officer Ethan Walker fully cooperated throughout the process. He answered every question honestly, reviewed his own body camera footage without interruption, and gradually recognized details that he had overlooked in the moment. Watching the recording from an objective perspective proved more difficult than standing beside the highway that afternoon. He noticed Maya Brooks remaining calm from beginning to end. He noticed that she had answered respectfully, followed instructions without resistance, and never attempted to use her family connection to influence the situation. The realization stayed with him long after each interview concluded. Maya continued her legal work without making public appearances or seeking media attention. Although reporters requested interviews almost every day after the recordings became public, she politely declined nearly all of them. Her message remained consistent whenever she chose to speak. She explained that lasting change required better judgment, stronger training, and equal dignity for every person rather than anger directed at one individual. Those words spread across television broadcasts, newspapers, and community meetings throughout Georgia. Many experienced law enforcement officers publicly agreed that professionalism depended not only upon following procedure but also upon recognizing when assumptions threatened sound judgment. David Brooks remained equally disciplined throughout the investigation. Despite serving as the state's attorney general, he refused to direct the review personally. Instead, he allowed the independent process to continue without interference, believing that public trust required complete transparency. His decision earned respect from both legal professionals and law enforcement leaders because it demonstrated that accountability carried the same meaning regardless of position or title. Several months later, the county police department announced new training initiatives based upon lessons learned from the incident. Recruits spent additional hours studying communication, decision-making under pressure, procedural fairness, and respectful interactions during routine traffic stops. Veteran officers also attended updated leadership seminars designed to reinforce careful judgment before authority. Ethan participated willingly in every session. Rather than hiding from his mistake, he accepted the uncomfortable responsibility of discussing it openly with instructors and fellow officers. Each conversation reminded him that experience was measured not only by years of service but also by the willingness to learn from failure. One afternoon, after completing another training seminar, Ethan unexpectedly encountered Maya outside the conference center. There were no cameras waiting nearby and no reporters asking questions. It was simply two people meeting again after circumstances had permanently changed their lives. Ethan approached respectfully and offered a sincere apology without excuses or qualifications. Maya listened quietly before thanking him for speaking honestly. She explained that forgiveness did not erase difficult memories, but it allowed people to build something better from them. Ethan nodded, understanding that genuine accountability extended far beyond disciplinary action. As they prepared to leave, both looked across the parking lot, where a new class of police recruits was arriving for orientation. Their conversations carried the energy of hopeful beginnings. Ethan realized that those future officers might never know every detail of what had happened on Interstate 75. Yet the lessons drawn from that afternoon would quietly shape the way they treated countless strangers throughout their careers. Sometimes the greatest measure of justice was not found in headlines or courtroom victories, but in the unseen moments when one difficult lesson prevented another painful mistake from ever happening again. Nearly 1 year passed before the story quietly returned to public attention. By then, the headlines had faded and the cameras had moved on, but the lessons continued shaping lives in ways that could not be measured by newspaper columns or television ratings. At the State Law Enforcement Academy, a new training program had become one of the most discussed portions of the curriculum. Recruits no longer studied only statutes, procedures, and tactical decision-making. They also spent hours examining moments when assumptions had influenced judgment. Among the case studies presented to each graduating class was the encounter that had taken place along Interstate 75. Instructors never focused on embarrassment or blame. Instead, they asked future officers to identify the exact moment when patience could have replaced assumption and when curiosity could have replaced certainty. Officer Ethan Walker occasionally stood before those classrooms, not because anyone required him to do so, but because he believed that sharing an uncomfortable truth might prevent another young officer from making the same mistake. He never attempted to defend his decisions. He simply described what he had believed at the time, what he later discovered through honest reflection, and how easily confidence could become a substitute for careful judgment. The recruits listened with unusual attention because they recognized genuine humility. Many later admitted that hearing an officer openly discuss his own mistakes carried greater impact than listening to a perfect lecture from someone who had never faced real consequences. Maya Brooks continued serving clients with the same quiet dedication that had defined her career before that afternoon. Her colleagues often noticed that she treated every person entering her office with identical respect, whether they held powerful positions or ordinary jobs. She rarely spoke about the highway incident unless someone sincerely asked what she had learned from it. Her answer remained remarkably consistent. She would smile gently and say that dignity became most valuable when circumstances tempted people to abandon it. That simple sentence gradually appeared in leadership seminars, university discussions, and community forums across the state. David Brooks watched these developments with quiet satisfaction. As Attorney General, he had spent decades believing that laws created order. As a father, he understood that character sustained justice long after written policies reached their limits. During one leadership conference, he addressed a room filled with judges, prosecutors, police chiefs, and community leaders. He never mentioned names or personal experiences. Instead, he reminded everyone that public trust was earned one respectful decision at a time. Every interaction between government and citizen became an opportunity either to strengthen confidence or weaken it. The audience responded with thoughtful silence because they understood the deeper meaning behind his words. Months later, Ethan and Maya crossed paths once more during a statewide public service event honoring partnerships between legal professionals and law enforcement agencies. Their conversation lasted only a few minutes, yet it reflected how far both had come. There was no awkwardness, no lingering resentment, and no attempt to rewrite the past. They spoke about new training programs, community outreach, and the responsibility shared by everyone entrusted with public service. As they walked in different directions, Ethan realized that the most important promotion he could ever receive would never appear on a badge or official document. It would be earned every day through wiser decisions, greater humility, and the quiet determination to treat every stranger with the same dignity that every human being deserved before anyone ever learned their name. Several years passed, yet the quiet lessons born beside Interstate 75 continued reaching people who had never heard the names of those involved. New officers entered service carrying a stronger understanding that every encounter represented more than a routine responsibility. Every conversation could either strengthen trust or slowly weaken it. The training program that had begun after that afternoon evolved into a statewide model adopted by additional departments across Georgia. Instructors noticed a meaningful change in classroom discussions. Recruits asked fewer questions about authority alone and more questions about judgment, communication, and the responsibility that accompanied a badge. Ethan Walker eventually became one of the department's field training officers. Some people found that surprising, but those who worked beside him understood exactly why he had earned the opportunity. He no longer measured success by the number of citations written or difficult situations controlled. Instead, he paid close attention to how new officers spoke to frightened drivers, confused witnesses, and ordinary citizens experiencing stressful moments. During ride-alongs, he often reminded young recruits that respect cost nothing but frequently determined everything that happened next. Whenever a trainee became too confident, Ethan quietly encouraged them to slow down, gather facts, and remember that assumptions rarely revealed the full story. Maya Brooks continued building a respected legal career devoted to public service and equal justice. She mentored young attorneys entering the profession, encouraging them to defend principles before personalities. Many admired her ability to remain calm even when facing difficult situations. Few knew that the strength they witnessed had been shaped long before she entered a courtroom. It came from believing that dignity should never depend upon circumstances or recognition. She frequently volunteered at community legal education events, helping families understand their rights while encouraging cooperation between neighborhoods and local law enforcement. Her message remained remarkably balanced. Accountability and respect, she often explained, were not opposing ideas. They were partners that protected both citizens and public servants. David Brooks eventually retired after decades of service, leaving office with a reputation built upon integrity rather than publicity. During his final address, he spoke not about victories, elections, or political achievements, but about trust. He reminded those listening that the law possessed enormous strength only when people believed it would be applied fairly to every individual. Many who attended the ceremony later recalled that speech as one of the most meaningful moments of his career because it focused entirely upon character instead of accomplishment. One autumn afternoon, long after retirement, David visited a community leadership event where Ethan and Maya had both been invited as guest speakers. The audience included students, teachers, police officers, attorneys, and local families. Rather than presenting separate speeches, they participated in a simple conversation about responsibility, humility, and public service. There were no dramatic stories or emotional appeals. Instead, each person described how one difficult day had reshaped countless decisions that followed. The audience listened quietly because genuine experience carried a sincerity that rehearsed speeches could never match. As the event concluded, people slowly left the auditorium carrying thoughtful expressions instead of excitement. They had not witnessed a celebration of power or status. They had witnessed something far more enduring. 3 people from different walks of public service had demonstrated that mistakes could become lessons, that dignity could remain unshaken even under pressure, and that the strongest form of justice often appeared not through punishment but through the courage to become better than the person each of them had been the day before. Years later, very few people remembered the exact date of the traffic stop along Interstate 75. Yet its quiet influence continued living inside decisions made every single day. New officers who had never met Ethan Walker still learned from the lessons he shared. Young attorneys who had never worked beside Maya Brooks still carried forward her belief that dignity should never depend upon position, appearance, or recognition. Community leaders who had never spoken directly with David Brooks often repeated one simple principle from his years of public service. Justice became strongest when it treated every person with equal respect before learning anything about their status. On a calm spring morning, Ethan drove the same stretch of highway where everything had once changed. The road looked ordinary. Families traveled toward vacations. Truck drivers continued their deliveries. Students returned home from college. Nothing about the landscape suggested that one quiet afternoon years earlier had transformed the lives of so many people. Ethan pulled into a small roadside overlook and stood for a few moments, listening to the familiar sound of passing traffic. He no longer remembered that place with embarrassment alone. He remembered it as the location where certainty gave way to humility, where procedure found balance through compassion, and where one difficult lesson became the foundation for a better career. Across the state, Maya finished speaking to a group of graduating law students preparing to begin their own journeys in public service. Rather than discussing success or ambition, she encouraged them to remember the humanity behind every legal file, every courtroom hearing, and every client seeking help. She reminded them that titles eventually changed, careers eventually ended, and public recognition eventually faded. Character remained when everything else disappeared. The students rose together in quiet applause, not because her words were dramatic, but because they felt undeniably true. Later that evening, David Brooks sat on the porch of his family home, watching the sun slowly disappear beyond the trees. Retirement had given him time to reflect upon decades spent serving the public. Of all the victories recorded in official documents, the one that stayed closest to his heart had never been a courtroom decision or legislative achievement. It had been watching his daughter choose dignity over anger and watching a young officer choose accountability over denial. Those choices could never be written into law, yet they strengthened justice in ways no statute ever could. Somewhere else in Georgia, another rookie officer completed a routine traffic stop. The conversation remained respectful. The encounter ended peacefully. Both people drove away carrying nothing more than a brief memory of an ordinary afternoon. Neither of them realized that years of thoughtful reforms, honest reflection, and quiet courage had helped shape that simple exchange. Sometimes the greatest victories were invisible because they prevented harm before it ever had the chance to appear. That was the legacy left behind by one unforgettable day. It was never about discovering that an ordinary woman belonged to an extraordinary family. It was about discovering that every person deserved extraordinary respect long before anyone knew their name. The badge represented responsibility. The law represented fairness. Dignity belonged to everyone. And in the end, the quietest form of justice became the one that echoed the longest, reminding every generation that true authority was never measured by power alone, but by the wisdom to see humanity before assumption and character before appearance.